Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone. We've got a few housekeeping items before we start the presentation. So, number one is please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please add them to chat, and the presenters will try to address them as the presentation goes along or at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, you also have the opportunity to ask questions, which we'll do in an orderly fashion, which is to raise your hand. There's a raise your hand function, and just do that, and we'll call on the questions as they go. We don't want this to be a ridiculously long presentation, so please, your questions should be more general and maybe not specific to your exact setup. The other thing is there will be announcements after the presentation, so please stay tuned for them so you can get the information on the virtual Christmas Summit being held April 10th and 11th. And then next week there is a roundtable discussion which we'll be addressing that after this presentation. So are you ready, Bill and Dave? Anyone who's going to be recording the presentation, any of the co-hosts, you can start your. Bill, have you started yet? We should
Um,
start.
I guess I'm recording.
Yeah, we're recording.
Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to season 4, episode 2 of xEssentials. Tonight is an exciting topic, which is 2020 Pixel Survey Report and what we can do about it. Bill Porter, you've got the floor.
All right. Well, first I realized I should have added one slide in the beginning just this moment, which is just to, tell people what we did. And basically we're presenting on facts, or not facts, we're presenting on data that was collected via a Google Form survey that we ran for a few months starting back in December. So just to clarify that for anyone that just showed up and didn't know what this is about, that's what this is about. Who am I to be talking right now? My name is Bill Porter. I'm an electrical engineer for the U.S. Navy. I've been working for the Navy for the past 11 years. I specialize in embedded design, system engineering, power systems, controls, robotics, that sort of thing. I've had to design systems, and then I've had to go support and figure out why my systems fail. So that's sort of the experience I've had. Now I'm gonna say we a couple times. When I say who are we, this idea was originally hatched out of the official xSlides vendor group admins, who are myself, Kevin, Chris, and Jonathan. It was actually Kevin's idea to start collecting the data, and I sort of took the lead on ways that I thought we could do it in a fair and as scientifically possible a way that we could do it. One of the guys in the vendor group proved to be very helpful in this because he apparently has a bachelor in science in fire science and worked as a fire investigator, and that's Chris. So Chris was very helpful talking to a lot about the stuff we learned and the pictures we looked at. I forget the guy's name who introduced me to him, but I did talk to an epoxy expert. His name was Joey Spendlove. So obviously we're going to be talking about epoxy a little later on. And I want to say special thanks to Keith Wesley, Daryl Collins, Brian Rudy, John Spiker, Russell McFarland, Jim Gray, a bunch more names that I'm forgetting. And of course, everyone that took the survey. These guys all helped me in different ways. They were sounding boards for some of the ideas, and they helped review my presentations some nights as well. I want to specify I have no financial stake with any vendor. However, I am friends with multiple vendors. And what I mean is, when we go to these events like the expos, I will drink socially with lots of people. And some of those people I will drink with are vendors. So just as a disclaimer, yes, if anyone finds a picture of me hanging out with a vendor, I hung out with everyone that I thought was cool at events like Expo and the Florida Mini and things like that. Why do we do this? Failure rates in fires appeared to be a large problem this year being 2020, more so than usual. Some people will think that's not the case, but one thing is certain, there was a lot more talk about failures this year being 2020. We saw lots of scary pictures of fires, lots of discussion of what was causing them. I saw a lot of people jumping to conclusions. I saw a lot of theories that had technical problems. And I saw a lot of people that were blaming users right off the bat and asking could it be user error? I felt some of this needed to be addressed. What we looked to collect, we were only asking people who had failures to fill out the survey. We were trying to see if we could find trends or patterns with the failures with the people that actually had them to see if we can come to a clue for the cause. We were asking, can we prove or disprove some theories with the data? The person whose idea it was to start this actually thought, were pixel pushers causing the failure? And I don't actually mention it in the slides because it wasn't significant, but it was an overwhelming no, because I think like 90% of people that took the survey said they did not use pixel pushers. All right, so there's extremely strong evidence it's not people damaging pixels with pixel pushers, as an example. What we didn't want to collect, well, we couldn't possibly quantify the entire pixel community. That would require us making sure that everyone took a survey to be able to make claims that require capturing the entire community. That's almost possible. We also didn't want to collect vendor bashing. So what I did was, the best of my abilities, I saw that in Google Forms you can require a Google sign-in, and then each account can only submit one survey entry. So we were trying to use that to prevent ballot box stuffing if anyone felt the need to spend an afternoon trying to falsify data. We are only going to reveal the vendors that showed a statistical difference from the rest. So we're not going to list every vendor that was stated. We're only listing the vendors that were statistically significant. Ooh, that's a mouthful. And who we've actually went out and talked to. What does that mean? That means and these are examples. I'm going to say this like 3 times. These are examples. We could say things like all reported fires had rainbow colored epoxy, or all high failure rate pixels were triangle shaped pixels. Yes, those are ridiculous on purpose because one of my reviewers said, make it ridiculous or else people think this is actual data. This is not data, this is an example. I'm illustrating a point. So if that's our example, things we can't say about that example is we can't say what % of rainbow colored epoxy pixels sold end up catching fire, because that would require capturing the entire community. We can't say when the rainbow colored epoxy pixels were made or sold. We can't say the percentage of good or bad pixels sold by any vendor, and we can't say if the customer is satisfied with the vendor's response. We purposely did not ask survey entries to list if they felt satisfied with the vendor. I wasn't really wanting to get in the game of moderating vendor reviews. I just was trying to look for people giving us the data of their pixels so we can try to put some pieces together. So that's an example of what we can say and what we can't say. But there is some common sense to this. Millions upon millions of pixels have been made with no issues. Any vendor can end up selling a bad batch of pixels, and that doesn't mean previous or future batches will be bad as well. We're going to get to this in a bit. We only had 102 usable survey results, means that the failure rate is very low compared to sales, or our sample size is very low, and that also has some implications for how trustworthy the data is with this low sample size. There's really no way to tell if we captured all the failures and there were low failures, or if we didn't capture all the failures. Everyone in this hobby should expect some failures. I'll talk about this in a minute, but 1 or 2 pixels failing a year should be normal. I've talked to some vendors that have had customers that are upset with 1 pixel failing, and I kind of want to make clear some failures are normal. So the real goal of our survey was to motivate vendors to be more open when they are aware of manufacturing issues caught after the sales, because it's only a vendor that could tell us if it's affected or who is affected, when they were sold, what the problem was, etc. I also have a goal of this presentation to turn everyone here into a better educated consumer, and I'm going to do that by busting some myths and I'm going to make a plea to promote some healthier online discussions. Oh my goodness, you guys are killing me. I guess I shouldn't use rainbow colored epoxy. To be super clear, I will be presenting data collected through the survey. I will be presenting the response from the 2 vendors who were shown a summary of this data already. I will be giving my expert opinion on what I believe the data shows. This includes knowledge gained when consulting with the epoxy vendor and the fire analysis expert. I can be wrong. That opinion is given under the assumption that the survey was answered honestly. I think it was. I don't think there was malicious people that took it. I think people were just frustrated and took it because they were hoping to get some result out of it. I'm going to hope that humans are generally trustworthy. I will be correcting some theories I've seen with engineering analysis as well. I did some examples. We'll talk about engineers, things like that, because I am one. So let's dive right into it before I lose my voice. We had 129 people take the survey. I had to go through and I had to throw some of those out. Some of the reasons I had to throw them out, they didn't report any failures. Some people just felt the need to tell me that they didn't have any failures. Or they reported failures that were like a subcolor of a pixel was bad, but the pixel still passed data. And I do not count that as a pixel failure. That's sort of just normal, rules of our hobby, that sometimes you get a pixel that doesn't show the right color. 9 reported a failure that I felt was unreasonably low, like below 0.1%. 5, the what they told us in the boxes or what they checked were just unclear, conflicting information. I couldn't really make sense of it. And 8, selected multiple vendors of multiple types, but didn't use the box to break down what types go with what vendors, so that we could be fair to assign that data to that vendor correctly. I need to stop reading the chat. I'm paying extra for Rainbow. Anyway, 102 entries left to consider after you deduct these that we are discounted. Hi, Scott. So as we started looking at the data, we discovered that the data became 2 distinct subsets that were distinct from each other when looked at 2 different ways. Fires/charring and dead pixels had 2 fairly unique data sets when separated. So we're going to discuss those 2 as 2 separate failure modes in a minute. I'm going to close the chat. So just looking at overall, what did we get in the survey? We got 102 survey entries. 71% were dead pixels. So that orange blob is dead pixels. 18% fires, 11% charring. So orange is dead, yellow is fires, blue is charring, blue-gray. The fire charring data sets looked very similar when separate. So we were combining them into one thermal event, because I believe it's one thermal event, but just the result of the event differs based on engineering stuff we're going to talk about later. So that was the overall survey results there for what types of failures. So we're going to jump right into fires and charring. And I'm going to beg you guys, stay with me for the next 45 minutes. Let's not jump to hating on anybody, jump to conclusions. Follow me all the way through this. Let me speak everything I want to speak, and then afterwards we can discuss it. Someone just asked, what about melting? Some people didn't pick charring or fired and they wrote in melting. I still changed that to charring, because in my mind, charring and melting is still something getting very hot. Either it's hot enough to melt it or it's hot enough to actually brown it. So fires and charring. Of the fires and charring reported, 85% were bought from Raywu. The 15% remaining were split across 4 other vendors, each no more than 5% individually. So this is a huge statistical anomaly. This is large enough margin to draw some conclusions, is my argument. To repeat, Ray has made millions of good pixels for many years. That doesn't mean you can't have a bad batch once or twice. I can't tell you when that batch is sold with any acceptable precision. We emailed them and I will show the response. I will not saying don't buy from Ray. However, if you're concerned, I advise you contact him with your concerns first. And we're going to deep dive further into this. So the pixel types of Ray's fires / charring, 68% were round or bullet. Round or bullet, the same thing. People just call them different words. And 32% were square. I'm talking to a couple of vendors, round generally outsells square by a lot. So to me, this is not statistically significant in any way. They both seem affected. Of the fires charring of Ray's pixels reported, 60% were 12-volt regulated. 60% were 12-volt unsure, 16% were 12-volt resistor, 8% were 5-volt. When we look at the other data set, I'm going to make an argument that the other data set is more representative of the community at large. This one is not. I'd argue, and some vendors have told me it's a good argument, there are more resistor regulators in the field than there are regulated. So the fact that we see regulated a bigger chunk here when really there's more resistor than regulated means this is probably a regulated problem. It's only affecting majorly regulated pixels. That 12%, that 16% unsure, that could go either way. That 60% could be added to the 60 and make it much more significant. It could be split up. It could be added to resistor. Those are just people that didn't know how to tell what kind of pixels they had. To be clear, many vendors have been selling regulated pixels for years without issue. Ray's been selling regulated pixels for years. There's nothing inherent to the design of a regulated pixel that makes them more likely to catch fire. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I believe the correct conclusion is I believe Ray sold a batch of regulated pixels with defective regulators. I'm going to make that argument here in a bit. But one more time, do not be afraid of regulated pixels. People use them because they produce more consistent color and can run longer without power injection. They do not get hotter than resistive pixels. And we'll talk about that later. We did contact Ray Wu. In the email, I gave him this data, and this is a cut and copy paste of his response. Most of my customers are smaller ones. Also, many of them buy from my AliExpress store directly. I sold more than 6.5 million pixels in 2020, so I guess that is the reason why it seems my pixels were a higher percentage. The regulated pixels have a higher failure rate than the resistor type because the regulated ones were designed with a 78 LO5 regulator, I'm going to assume, which makes the whole pixel to be 0.65 watts when at full white, so much more heat than the resistor. Also, the regulated pixels are with more components than resistor ones. Hey, is someone not muted? Because I'm hearing noise. Here's my thoughts to that response. His first argument, to me, he's kind of making, I sell the most, and therefore I'm the most because I sell the most. The results were 85% Ray and 5% the next largest vendor, and that's too significant to explain away the sales volume difference. I tried to see if I could get a little bit more data to kind of put that in perspective, and I asked several vendors if they were willing to share their 2020 sales volume as a comparison. Most declined. One responded that they would tell me as long as I kept them anonymous, and their sales volume was 4.4 million. So Ray's 6.2 to this guy's 4.4. That means Ray really doesn't sell that much more, at least not 10 times more, which would be required to explain why he was the most prevalent in this category. Again, you have to be honest that Ray and the other vendor are being honest with me about those sales volume numbers. So to me, this kind of disproves that argument that he's only statistically significant because he sells the most. He may sell the most, but not enough, not 5% to 85%. It's not tenfold more than any other vendor, as evidenced by the other vendor's 4.4 million. So to me, that doesn't really explain that away. His second point about the power argument, I quite don't understand. The LED and the driver chip are what sets the power draw of the pixel. It's actually defined in the spec sheet of the pixel controller itself. All pixels are about 50 milliamp or 0.25 watts. Full white. 12 volt pixels must dissipate another 12 volt pixels must dissipate another 0.35 watts as heat. This is the same power that has to be dissipated whether through a resistor or regulator. All pixels are basically 5 volt. All 12 volt pixels have to take 12 volts and make it 5 volt. They all do it by converting the extra voltage to heat. Regulator pixels do it through a regulator. Resistor pixels do resistors. So I'm assuming Ray's 0.65 watt comment must have been him talking about this extra dissipation. But again, resistor pixels have to do this too. They aren't magic. Both of the drop 12 volts to 5 volts, so I don't understand this part of his response. I believe that these were just defective regulators that failed to a high impedance short, heated up, and in some cases caught fire. There's an alternative theory that this could be an epoxy failure that led to corrosion across the power leads on a regulator that shorted and heated up to a fire. We will discuss epoxy failures in a minute because we did have epoxy failures. If that is the case, there could be a thought that resistor pixels may not have a place in the circuit board where 12 volt and ground are close, like they are next to a regulator. So it's harder to form a shorting corrosion. It's harder to form shorting corrosion at distance, which explains why they wouldn't have failed as much. One of the most telling, I don't want to say proof, but you're about to see a video that I think is very interesting because someone caught a fire happening in real time. And this is an amazing video. So this is this video. Let's see if I can play it. There we go. So here's someone who submitted this video because they caught their pixel burning in real time. Now I froze this frame and put it on the right because I believe this guy's a little bit anal, and I think he made sure all his pixels were turned the same way on each column. And if you note, the pixel above the burning pixel, that's the regulator the arrow is pointing to. So if you move your view down 1 pixel and look through that hole to see what device is red hot, that would be the regulator that is red hot. So this is an amazing video because it's literally catching a regulator heating up to the point where it's glowing red. But it's also something interesting because the pixel did not catch fire. The epoxy did not light off. Basically, the regulator got hot enough to melt a hole through the epoxy, but not hot enough to actually ignite the epoxy to the point where it was self-consuming the epoxy. So this guy was lucky to have caught this fire, and it didn't actually turn into a full fire. It was just a regulator glowing hot, burning a hole through the side of the pixel. I think I'm just gonna let it play one more time and take a drink because it's pretty awesome. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Something interesting, what we saw is something interesting. We had lots of submitted pictures of fires where it's evident that the entire pixel was not consumed. The epoxy did not light off. I actually, with Chris on Zoom, set fire to some pixels in my garage with a blowtorch. If you can get the epoxy to ignite, there's nothing left after the fire. The whole thing turns to ash. These pixels of what people submitted, everything except this one on the lower right. This one right here, I'd argue, actually caught the epoxy on fire because there's no more epoxy left. The other pixels clearly just burned a hole out the side of the pixel. And it's hard, because if the pixel gets damaged enough, it's really hard to tell if that's where the regulator is, but I think it is. I think that's the regulator in the square pixel in the upper right that you can sort of see. I think all these spots should line up where the regulator is in the board for the fire coming out. And to be clear, the best part of the data we collected from the survey was people who had already done these investigations. We got a lot of good photos, we got a lot of good videos, we got a lot of theories from those people, and that really enabled us to draw conclusions without doing a lot of investigation on our own. Someone just posted about rain. We did have a question in the survey to ask about water, and it was not conclusive from what we could tell from the responses. All right, let's jump into myth busting. I had some people ask me, why did we not collect brightness settings in the survey? Well, first off, before we even started the survey, people had submitted videos and photos of fires starting in the middle of the day when the pixels were off but still energized. During show conditions, pixels are off more than they are on. If you pick any pixel in your show and just stare at it and play your sequences, they're probably off more than they're on. And when they are on, they're usually one or two primary colors. They're not white. I'd also argue that most people who use 12 volt with long runs are only doing so by going lower in brightness. So my argument is any failure analysis that is made with the worst case, aka 100% white for long duration, is flawed, as these are very rare conditions in practice. So if you're trying to put an argument together for a failure mode that requires worst case for a while, that's not a good argument because that's not what we do in our shows. This is also why I have an issue with Ray's response about power, because people aren't pushing 0.65 watts to their pixels all the time. On average, they're doing much less than that. Even still, a pixel that can't run continuously at 100% white is a defective pixel in my book. We shouldn't have to baby them. Myth busting number 2, and I've seen a couple people with this attitude, and I call it the anti-Ron Howard. Does lack of power injection contribute to fires? No. Wires are not perfect conductors. Really, wires are long resistors. Due to physics / wire impedance and the low voltage we use, you can't really overload a string of pixels with too many pixels on it. And that's because pixels will consume less current once the voltage they see has dropped by about 6 volts, depending on pixel type. Any potential weak points in the wire or circuit board add resistance that causes the voltage to drop sooner, that causes less pixels on the string to draw full current. It's sort of like a self-feedback system. The effect goes away when you use higher voltage, 24 volts, 36 volts, etc. Then you have more voltage to cause problems. This is also why you could cause problems with 120 volt AC lights, because now that voltage is high enough that you could cause problems with too many lights plugged in together. And to sort of illustrate that example, here's 100 pixels on full white drawing 4.6 amps. If I tack on another 200 pixels, theoretically it should be drawing over 8 amps. But it only goes up 0.2 amps in reality. That's because there's no longer enough voltage due to voltage drop to keep feeding those pixels. And that's also an interesting number. Notice most of our controllers have a 5 amp fuse in them. And just by the nature of our pixel wire, we can't seem to pull more than 5 amps no matter how many pixels we plug into each other without power injection. Power injection changes that. With no power injection, we seem to hit an upper limit of about 5 amps no matter how many pixels we start plugging in together. So So that's sort of diffusing. Does the lack of power injection contribute to fires? A lack of power injection just means you're more likely to get pink pixels. You're not going to have fires due to bad design because you didn't use power injection. Ron Howard's house is safe. Myth busting number 3. Correct fusing should have prevented this, right? Well, no, sorry. Like before, wire resistance somewhat regulates what can be fed into a fault. In order to get one hot spot, to get one spot hot enough to start a fire, it needs something. It needs resistance itself. Dead shorts don't get very hot themselves because they are low resistance. So there's a balance. You need just the right amount of resistance at the right place in a string to get enough energy into a fault to start a fire. Too close to the front of the string, next to the power supply, then you could actually build a fuse, yes. Too far at the end, then there's not enough power that can be fed into the fault, and you just get a hot pixel, maybe some charring. So somewhere in the middle, there's a sweet spot range where you can get enough current into a fault through those wires to start a fire without blowing your fuses. The fuses actually don't protect from fires. Sorry, guys. Here's an example. I created a pigtail that was a dead short, tied the power wires together the best I could, made a good connection. If I stuck that dead short pigtail at the end of 100 pixels and a 10-foot lead wire, I'm only drawing 4 amps out of my power supply. So a dead short after 100 pixels won't even blow a 5-amp fuse. And that's a dead short. What I'm trying to reinforce here is that, there's other things at play, and wires aren't perfect conductors. Wires can limit what gets fed down the string themselves. So in this example, the wires of this pixel string itself is limiting the current that can be fed into a dead short. And this dead short after 100 pixels would not blow my fuse. You go further, you put the dead short at 200 pixels, now it drops to 2.8 amps. So now the further away you're getting from your power supply down the line of pixels, the less power you draw in a dead short condition. So both of these dead shorts wouldn't even blow in my 5-amp fuses in my pixel controller. But Bill, where's that power going? Yes, as John D says, that doesn't mean don't fuse, because you could have a dead short against your pixel controller. And if you've not fused and you have a dead short against your pixel controller becomes your fuse. So yes, absolutely, John, I need to be reinforced, you need to fuse, but fuses don't stop fires. They can stop some problems, not all problems. So where's the power going when it's only drawing 4 amps? Well, the power is going into creating a big heater out of the entire string of pixels. So that's a thermal camera. You'll notice that the front little cluster of pixels along that 100 pixel strand has gotten up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And the dead short itself has barely gotten hot at all. So the end of the string where the dead short exists, where 12 volt is shorted to ground, has only gotten to 87 degrees. But along the string itself, where some of the pixels are, have gotten to 100 degrees. So this is the case where we're dissipating all the power over a wide area, so that wide area doesn't get very hot. What we need to start a fire is we need to get a lot of power into a little area. So how do we get a lot of power into a little area? You need the right amount of resistance at the right place. Now, everyone talked to me about how I could demonstrate what, trying to control or start a pixel fire. I can't predict what pixel will be the next one to fail, but there is a good analogy for what the kind of failure we need. And that good analogy, if anyone is in the model rocket business, they know what this thing is. This is a model rocket igniter. This is a cool little device. It's got 2 little wires. You basically hook it up to a little box with a 9-volt battery and a button, and it causes the model rocket to explode, to fire off. You'll notice in the specifications, it specifies a resistance. It says this igniter's resistance is 1.6 ohms. Because like I said, in order to get a fire, we need the right amount of resistance in the right place. This is on purpose a manufactured right amount of resistance in a little bit of area, because this is a case where we want to start a fire. Hold on, I take a break and drink burning. So, in our last example, dead short, no fires. Also, no fuses blown, unfortunately. Here is 100 pixels again with the model rocket igniter at the end of the 100 pixels. So we're going to feed this power, same amount of voltage, through the same 10-foot leader plus 100 pixels, but this time instead of a dead short, I've added that model rocket igniter. So we went from nearly 0 ohms to 1.8 ohms. And take a look at the difference a little bit of resistance makes. This is in slow motion, by the way. Sorry for the strobing. So by having the right amount of resistance in a small area in the right place, we went from, don't blow your fuse, don't cause anything, to we started a fire. Oh, I guess I'll play it again. Why not? Let's watch more fires since we're talking about them. Now it's a party. I agree. Let's move on. Myth busting number 4. Are 5-volt pictures less prone to fire? Yes, let's start the voltage wars, because why not? The answer is yes, / needs context. The same effect with physics as the last slide. The sooner you lose voltage, the less current you draw, applies here. And there's also another equation that comes into play. That equation is power equals voltage squared over resistance. That's the equation for the power you can feed into a fault increases exponentially with increased voltage fed into the fault. However, power injection makes this complicated. A fault close to a power injection point could still cause a fire even with 5 volts, because then there's less wire resistance between the power supply and the fault, means less voltage drop. So the correct statement is 5 volts can still catch fire depending on conditions. However, it is less likely. And for those that just glazed over, let me give a demonstration of that equation. If we have a 2 ohm fault, and I use 2 ohms because this model rocket igniter was 1.8 ohms, so it's pretty close to what the model rocket igniter was. You use the equation power equals voltage squared over resistance. A 12-volt string can feed 72 watts into that fault. A 5-volt string can feed 12.5 watts into that fault. So let me ask you, which of those can get hotter, aka which is the bigger number by far? So again, the correct statement is 5 volts can still catch fire depending on conditions. However, it is less likely. Okay. Why were the fires different? Why did we have, full-on failure that was unfortunately something we saw with Spiker? Or why do we have a lot of those pictures that were just holes that popped out of the pixel? Well, where on the pixel string the fault happens defines how much power is fed into it via all the things we just saw. Distance from the power supply defines how much power can be fed into it. All the list goes on for all the different parameters around trying to quantify why some fires are worse than others. So to get the worst kind of fire, you need the maximum amount of power you can, plus a little bit of oxygen to get the epoxy to ignite. So I'm going to call this the John Spiker luck factor. Here's the fault tree that we're going to walk down that is now named after John Spiker. Do your pixels have a faulty regulator? If yes, does that pixel exist in the sweet spot along the string? If yes, does the failing regulator get hot enough to ignite the epoxy? Remember, that means the right amount of resistance in the right place to get the right amount of power, to get the right amount of heat to ignite that epoxy. If yes, does the epoxy fire get hot enough to ignite the chloroplast? If yes, is your roof flammable? The only person I don't know if so far that answered yes to all those 5 of those is Spiker. That's why that's the John Spiker failure tree. I'd also argue a large percentage of the fire failures stop at 2 or 3, as evidenced by the videos and the pictures of the pixels we saw of charred but not bursting or open pixels, or if they opened up, they didn't fully engulf the epoxy. So this is my long attempt to explain all the different factors at play that govern how lucky or unlucky you are when you have a failure. So to wrap this up, survey shows strong evidence of a bad batch of 12-volt regulated pixels from Ray. Ray claims the regulators somehow burn more power than resistors and that he outsells the most, yet he sells the largest quantity to explain his large percentage of survey responses. Many pixel fires can't be prevented with proper fusing or testing. Sorry, guys. Adding power injection changes the chances somewhat of a full fire versus a charred fire pixel, but it does not cause or prevent it. What does play a big part is luck. That plays a big part in how bad it gets if you have defective pixels. So that's the end of fire. Any real questions? I don't think I see any. There's a lot of talk.
Yes. Can you explain their second to last bullet point? Adding power injection changes the chances, but which way, up or down? Does power injection lead towards full fire, or does power injection lead towards charred pixel?
Adding power injection could change it to be slightly more likely that it's a full fire. Because when we talk about the sweet spot or the sweet zone along the pixel strand where you get maximum heat, as you add power injection points, you're adding more sweet zones. So It's not a lot. It's just one of those things where I have to say it's technically adding, but to be honest, it's such a marginal effect, because if you're actually going to do a analysis of someone who did no power injection versus someone who did power injection, the people that didn't do power injection are going to have multiple strands, each with their own connection to the power supply. The person that didn't do it are going to have power injection points. So thinking about it again, maybe I shouldn't even say it does somewhat increase it, but it's such a small percent, it's not even worth talking about, if that makes sense. So I don't know why I talked about it, but I did. Oh well. All right, moving forward. Anybody? All right, moving forward. Dead pixels. Well, I'm a stickler for terminology, so let's clarify the term dead pixels. Right after I take a sip of this drink. Any pair of pixels that stops passing data is a dead pixel. We are never sure if it's the last working one not sending the data or the first dark one having other issues, but in total there's one dead pixel there. Remember, we did not count people describing lost.
Bill, stop for a second. Your presentation went away.
Oh, interesting. I also had an orange light somewhere on my Zoom window for some reason. Is it working now?
Yes, you're back.
Computer caught fire. So remember, we do not count people losing a loss of a subcolor, but an otherwise working pixel that passes data as a dead pixel. These are pixels that we hate because they literally make the rest of the prop dark. Hey, we're more than halfway through. All right. Cool. Oh, come on. PowerPoint's not working. So of people that reported dead pixels, here's the distribution between the vendors. 50% were Ray, 23% were RGB Man, and 7% were Paul. The remaining 20% are split across 7 other vendors with no one vendor over 5%. So obviously right here is orange, RGB Man is that bluish color, and the first large dark grayer one is Paul. We contacted RGB Man, and I asked him the question that everyone already told me is Paul the supplier of his pixels, and am I allowed to say it? And he said, yes, you can say it, and Paul is the supplier of my pixels. So what we did is we combined Paul's and RGB Man's, and that changes to a 30% chunk of the response, which is significant. Why RGB Man is higher than Paul, maybe it's the Facebook bias. RGB Man does a lot of business on Facebook. This survey was advertised on Facebook, so we captured probably mostly Facebook people and not other people. So let's combine RGB Man and Paul, and now the pie looks like this. Sorry for the color changes, but Ed's theme messed with all my pie colors, and I already made this a screenshot, so it didn't change with the theme. Thanks, Ed. Remaining 20% is split across 7 other vendors, no one vendor over 5%. Of the dead pixels reported, here's the distribution of pixel type. 45% 12-volt resistor, 27% 12-volt regulated, 70% 12-volt unknown, 10% 5-volt. 79% round, 21% square. Round, remember, round is bullet, depending on what word you like to use. I've showed this to a couple people. We all agree this is probably a good sampling of what just normal distribution is in the community. AKA, there's more resistor out in the wild. There is some regulated, and altogether there's a lot more 12-volt than there is 5-volt. A lot of people agree this just shows the normal distribution of what's in the wild. So that means none of this plays a factor, but it has to be something that's common to all of these. So what is common to all these types of pixels that isn't voltage or shape? Housing, epoxy, soldering? Well, we didn't have to wait long because you guys already figured this out, because we got a ton of pictures and reports of people saying it's epoxy. We got lots of cracked epoxy. We have other epoxy problems. We see rust under our pixels. It's something to do with epoxy. Can we say that's the only issue? No. I had some people write in that they thought they had bad solder joints. You know, they sent 1 or 2 pictures of what they thought was a bad solder joint. And that's hard to prove, but yeah, I could kind of agree that picture did look like it. One person showed me that they could literally flex their pixel and it would work and not work depending on flexing the pixel. That could be another issue, but that's one of those issues that would be really hard to track or prove. But epoxy is easy to prove because holy crap, we got a ton of these pictures. Pictures of cracks, Pictures with cracks already showing rust underneath the cracks, showing water ingress. Pictures of cracks like in that bullet at the top, where as soon as they peeled off the rubber, that the epoxy just fell apart, like the rubber around the pixel was the only thing holding the epoxy together. We had one, unfortunately, I couldn't find the video in my folder of all the stuff submitted, but someone actually sent us a video where they, all in one cut, pulled out a box of pixels, found the ones that looked cracked, put a tape on the string next to them, laid them out on the sidewalk, and then used a hair bottle water sprayer and sprayed them while they were in a test mode. And within 5 minutes, they started flickering. That was Troy. Thank you for that video, Troy. I couldn't find it. It's a great video. He did a good job investigating it. I think it's a nice smoking gun for, I can literally show you a cracked pixel and literally spray it with water and then it starts flickering. Great video. I may have been doing this presentation up to about 10 minutes ago, Troy, so I didn't have time to go hunt your video down, but it was a good video. Just looking at the vendors of cracked pixels, only 30% of responses total reported that they noticed cracked pixels. 69% were Ray Wu, only 17% were RGB Man and Paul. And at this point, I was tired of making pie charts, so I didn't make a pie chart. So someone just look at the percentages and visualize it, because I was done with the pie charts at this point. I was running out of pie charts theme. There was also a secondary epoxy issue that we saw. And it was one that I actually started finding in a small group of people, and I started expanding to asking more and more people if they had it. It was very soft epoxy. A lot of people that had bought Raywu pixels for many years would pick out an old pixel, take off the rubber, and the epoxy was hard as a rock. You couldn't even hit it with a hammer. It wouldn't even dent. It wasn't going anywhere. But when they took out a pixel from 2020, and with very little effort and needle nose pliers, they were able to peel the epoxy off, and it was the consistency of gummy bears. So they were describing it to me as the epoxy was the consistency of gummy bears. And this was actually pictures that Keith took, so thank you for that, Keith. But it's a good indication of what we saw. So what we could say is there was a change in the epoxy that was soft. What we're not sure of, because we can't make that correlation equals causation argument, we're not sure if that actually causes failures or not. And my pixel expert couldn't tell me that either. All we can say is we found out that pixels in 2020 tended to have soft epoxy, and pixels before that did not. Okay. Ray's response. Ray said, I did have a bad batch of epoxy resin last year, which caused the pixels cracked after several months and water came in. But I think it was only one bad batch of them, actually. I had sent many replacements to customers. I now use another resin supplier with higher and much stable quality. The issue will not happen again. So Ray's acknowledging he had an epoxy problem. RGB Man response. RGB Man, we had a long phone call, so I'm kind of having to summarize what we talked about on the phone a bit here. His quote was more or less, once we started getting feedback with customers reporting epoxy problems, Paul shut down his line for a week and fixed the issue. I also believe that there were some QC issues related to COVID shutdown that affected the parts and quality. Now that things have settled down and the epoxy filling machine fixed, things have returned to normal. Any of all my customers that had pie failure rates should contact me if they feel the issue was not resolved. So now we have both Ray and Paul acknowledging some sort of epoxy issue last year. So that sort of confirms what the survey collected was, that we had an epoxy issue. And I'm glad the vendors were open with saying, yes, we had an epoxy issue. It's a very small quantity, and we think we've taken care of our customers. Why do we care about the epoxy? Epoxy is what seals the circuit board, the wire, the connection, and the components from water. And water equals bad for electronics. Great for drinking, especially if you add some hops, bad for electronics. All these failures, if related to the epoxy, means the epoxy failed and let water get in, caused corrosion, or disrupted the operation of the pixel. If you don't need rainwater to get water, you don't need rain to get water either. It's literally in the air too. Notes from talking to my epoxy expert. Some of the points he was trying to make to me is picking the right epoxy is a very difficult task. Epoxy, the different types of epoxies have different abilities to bond to different surfaces. And when you have an assembly like a pixel, you have to pick a special epoxy that bonds to all three surfaces. It has to bond to the wire jacket, the jackets of the wires to make a seal. it has to bond to the rubber, and it has to bond to the circuit board and the parts on the circuit board to seal them. So picking the correct epoxy to bond against all three surfaces, that's something that's actually pretty hard. When asked about the soft epoxy, he said it could be bad materials used, expired material, or incorrect ratio of hardener. He offered that there could be other materials that you could use in an assembly like a pixel that isn't epoxy and would be soft. But he was telling me that they're more likely to be more expensive than epoxy, so he wouldn't see how pixels getting cheaper would switch to a more expensive material than epoxy. He also didn't give me a metric, but he did say fire-resistant epoxy is much, much more expensive. And what was amazing about his phone call was in the first minute, before I even got very deep at all, I explained who I was, what the hobby was, and I was calling about what I believe may be the China effect. And he stopped me and he goes, oh, let me tell you about my industry. In my industry, all the epoxy comes from China. And it's only a couple factories. And we literally have to babysit our factory, because if we don't, they will try to switch materials on us and give us inferior stuff. So we literally pay someone to sit there and babysit our factory to make sure they continue to use the same quality parts in all our projects. And I was laughing out loud because we're going to talk about that a little later. I was like, that's exactly what an argument I'm going to make a little bit later about some of our vendors. Other theories for dead pixels. Like I said, there was soldering. Some people reported that may have been a soldering issue. People could either see what looked like poor solder joints, so they were able to move the pixel and it worked again. Some people, when testing for the soft epoxy issues, meaning they were digging into the epoxy to prove it was soft and malleable, they could pick off the epoxy, and the parts that are supposed to be on the circuit board would come off with the epoxy and not stay on the circuit board, which to me means that does actually sort of lend to a possible soldering issue where they weren't soldered well to the circuit board. But a soldering issue is very hard to track or verify, because that's not something everyone can spot, like they can spot cracks in epoxy. So let's wrap up the survey a bit. Fires and dead pixels seem to be unrelated. Maybe not, but that's my theory. Other people may disagree. Maybe the cracking, failing epoxy, letting the water in causes corrosion, causes the fires, and it's not just the regulators causing the fire. That there is some validity to that. I just don't think it's likely. I will argue that 2020 was probably an unusually high year for failures, but overall those failures are small. Remember, we only had 128 people take the survey. I know people were already commenting they didn't take the survey and had failures. So there is an unknown margin of people that had failures that we don't quantify, but I still think it's a very small percentage of what actually is out there. So I don't want everyone doomed and gloomed. If these were truly single batch issues from pixels, that batch may have been only sold in the period of a week. I don't know. I asked both vendors to try to give me some idea of how long that batch could have been sold, and neither would answer that. Both vendors we talked to do acknowledge the epoxy issue in some way, which kind of, validates our theory that it's an epoxy issue, which, to be honest, with all those pictures was pretty obvious. There was no direct acknowledgement of a fire issue or what caused it. But again, he made a comment on regulated pixels that to me doesn't make any engineering sense. But we're not done yet. I still have 10 more slides. Oh, fun. At least I'll get done in maybe an hour. Oh, my favorite myth. All pixels come from the same factory, so there's no reason to buy from a US vendor. I have seen so many versions of this in comments on Facebook, and it drives me insane. This is false. Needs context. There are several factories, and even if there weren't, the same factory was able to produce different qualities depending on the customer's orders. Factories can make crap, factories can make gold, all about what the customer is willing to pay and what they're asking for in the assembly of their product. AKA, the customer of the factory has control over the quality of the product made. So even if it was all one factory, when you're picking your vendor, you're picking both that factory and the person controlling the quality that factory uses when making a product. It could be the same entity, it could be a reseller, or it could be a seller who works at the factory, but I'd argue most vendors are not factories. There's probably, I've talked to people that have been in there and they think there's about 3 to 4 factories maybe. But again, it could be the same factory, but when you're picking your vendor, you're picking someone who's inputting an order to that factory to meet certain specifications. So that's why the context of this myth that there's no reason to buy from US vendors is false in my mind. How do I know this? Well, I talk to my vendors. Have you guys talked to your vendors? I recommend talking to vendors. Most are pretty nice usually. The 2 vendors that I talk to a lot that have been with me for most of my years in this community. The first one is Todd, DIY Daily Express. He used to hang out in the forum chat rooms back in the forum days before Facebook even took off. And he would vent to me and tell me stories about his manufacturer would try and sell him in cost reduction options, and that he declined because he felt it was cutting corners, or how he'd get pixels that he would spot test, and the spot test would show failures, so he'd just eat the cost of those failures and not send those pixels out. The other person who I knew before he was a vendor, because he frequents expos and has other events, I've talked to him a lot too, just even before this whole issue came about. He tries to visit his factory that he uses annually in person, just to keep a good relationship with the factory. He also sets rules with them, including that they aren't allowed to make changes to the materials used in the pixels made for him without his consent. So yeah, all pixels come from China, but who's setting the bar for the quality of the materials used in your pixels? Now, I'm not saying those are the only two vendors that do this. I'm sure a lot of them do it. Those are just the two I know because I've talked to them. So I'm saying you should ask your vendor what they do. Ask them to, and make a case for what their value added to get your money is. And to be honest, I would argue that American vendors should do a better job at selling themselves and explaining this value added. Why do you pay more for an American vendor? Because it's someone that you can talk to who's controlling the factory, who's maintaining a level of quality, and is a lot easier to get a hold of when you have a problem. So I'm just trying to kill this myth because it's a big myth. All pixels from the same factory, so there's no reason to buy from a US vendor, to me is false for all those reasons. I also want to remind everyone, the world is buyer beware by default. I had a couple people give me the attitude that just because they can spend the money, they have the right to get a working product. And I call that the Amazon effect. This isn't Amazon. You shouldn't expect good customer return policy and customer support from everyone you can possibly get money from. I mean, there's that weird Wish app that I hear is just terrible. There are ways you can spend money on bad stuff and get bad stuff, and you don't have the right for that stuff to work. You have your own responsibility to make your purchasing decisions. You should do your own research, probably off Facebook. You should ask the vendors what value they add. You shouldn't even take my word on it. You should do your own research. You're responsible for your purchasing decisions. Personal responsibility. Another note. I'm almost done with notes, I promise, of lecturing. This is a plea. This is the plea that we shouldn't have had to done this. We have social media. We have the tools at our hands to be able to have discourse that could allow us to see something happens. What happened though is a lot of people came to me and they said, Bill, thank you for doing the survey, because I either made a post but then deleted it because of what happened, or I saw what happened in other people's posts and I decided not to make a post. And what they're saying is all these vendor fanboys would jump into their comments and it would just be a lot of noise of people arguing, fanboys back and forth and bad memes and things like that. That's all bad discourse. All that noise takes away from the actual discussion that could have happened on Facebook. We could have had people working together to figure out there was a statistical anomaly of certain vendors or certain pixels causing problems, had that noise not caused people to fear away from talking about it on Facebook. If that had happened, maybe we wouldn't have had to use this survey to put the picture together. Maybe we could have put the picture together on Facebook if we didn't have all these people that were being quote unquote vendor fanboys jumping in comment threads, contributing nothing of value to the discussion. Everyone should acknowledge. So don't be the I've used this vendor for years with no problems guy on posts of people sharing their experience. It takes away from the otherwise meaningful discourse on trying to figure out causes of failures. Everyone should know that vendors 99% of the time put out working product. That doesn't need to be reinforced every time someone says, hey, I bought these pixels from this vendor at this time and they're having problems. Does anyone else notice this? If the comments were just left to other people that had noticed it, we could have put this puzzle together much quicker without this extra work. But unfortunately, what we get is 1,000 people going, I use that vendor and I have no problems. I use that vendor and I have no problems. And it would elevate from there and people would literally delete their posts because they were tired of the discussion going that way. Without that noise, maybe the trends could have been better spotted without all this work. Oh, okay, I'm done with that one. All right, some good news to end on. We are improving. Boscoyo is switching to all coral material to a new product that is more fire resistant. I'm going to say there was one last note on Ray's message. He says he's also looking into fire resistant epoxy for this year's pixels, even if it makes the pixels more costly. That was his quote. And to me, or to my epoxy expert, that should make it more expensive because the fire retardant epoxy is more expensive than regular epoxy. That's why all epoxy is not fire retardant. And then finally, here's a video that James sent me to show his new fireproof Coro. So here's a sample of old Coro and new Coro, both being lit by a blowtorch. All right, I'm seeing, this is actually the end of my presentation. I'm seeing Wally Lights posted that he has a page that explains his quality control. That's great. Thank you, Wally Lights, for explaining what a US vendor, what the value added for you is. Does there seem to be a difference in flammability of the epoxy in the various off-the-shelf regulated pixels out there at the moment too? So I didn't mention this, but I spent the night with Chris on the phone trying to set pixels on fire on purpose with a blowtorch. Some of the interesting things that it was actually Chris's idea. I actually couldn't get a lot of pixels to start on fire at all until I whacked them with the hammer and they cracked, and then they would light off like a firework. And Chris had that idea because his argument was you need to get oxygen deeper into the epoxy on more surface area to get the right ratio to start a fire, and he was dead right. So we, to answer the question, is it different flammability in epoxies various off-the-shelf pixels? I can go back to my pixel expert or my epoxy expert and ask. I don't have a good answer for that. I think the it's complicated is probably an overall good answer for that question, just like it is for the other stuff we answered. Let's see, I'm trying to scroll.
Can I answer John Storm's question real quick?
Sure.
So the answer is no. They'll cover it based upon your insurance policy, but afterwards you will be canceled.
Is that what happened to you?
For people that
No.
Can't read the chat, can you read his question and then answer?
Oh, so John, let me go back to chat. John Storms asked specifically, if you have a fire, will your homeowner's insurance cover it? Yes, they will. They'll cover it, but you more than likely will be canceled afterwards. I personally did not submit my fire to my homeowner's insurance, so I don't have that, but I did. A good friend of mine does do insurance policies, and she told me straight up that I would have been canceled.
I would imagine that answer can vary depending on the location, depending on the actual insurance that you're holding. It's not like a one size fit all thing, but I would imagine that since it's not UL approved, that you're going to lean on the side of it causing issues.
So there's an Alan H in here who sounds like another epoxy expert, and he had a long paragraph about how complicated epoxy is. And that's more or less what the other guy was telling me too. Epoxy is very complicated. It takes a lot of work, and that's probably one of the more expensive parts of the pixel itself. And like everything he listed in his comment, there's a lot to it.
There's a question from Facebook, in the Facebook chat that says, has anyone had the strips with pixels catch fire?
None were reported. People are asking, I have unopened boxes of X pixels. Should I contact them? I'd say you probably should. Just keep it short. Say why you're concerned, and maybe just pull them out and test them before you even contact them, and maybe you'll just be fine. Oh, someone here is an insurance agent that could have answered that apparently. It varies by company and varies by size. People asked about what's the types of pixel pushers. So the survey had a box for people to say what their pixel pusher was, and that they could type in what it was. But again, the percentage of people that answered yes to pixel pushers was like 5 or 6%. It was very low. So it was a good indication that pixel pushers had nothing to do with the failures. Someone private messaged me, is it possible that the softer epoxy is melting around a hot regulator and essentially becoming liquid? I think either epoxy would probably, if the regulator got white hot or almost white hot, to me, I think good or weak epoxy would have melted around that. But the epoxy guy in here could probably clarify that if it's getting several hundred degrees in that little regulator, which I think it is, I think either epoxy would have failed. Someone reposted Alan. Yep, Alan sounds like a good guy. I almost want to talk to him later. Someone reported they did have a melting strip, but it was not on fire, just melting. So I guess that once someone did melt. The vendors
Another
that I
question
listed.
from Facebook.
Okay, good.
I'm sorry, Bill. I've heard of people who use burn-in. Do you have any recommendations on testing or burn-in?
Spiker would tell you to burn in. I don't. To me,
I won't tell you. I will say it. It's worthless.
Oh, okay. Spiker changed his mind. I guess fire will do that to you.
Yeah. So to answer that question, all of my pixels were burned in for 24 hours at basically 100% white. It ran on my house for 6 weeks without a problem. New Year's Eve is when it caught on fire. So no, it's useless. If it's going to burn out, it's going to burn out right away.
All the vendors whose names I listed except Paul, I technically didn't go to Paul directly, but I went, Michael RGB man, was comfortable commenting on behalf of Paul for me. So, the two vendors I spoke to and showed this data to were Ray and RGB man. Should a vendor like Paul or Ray replace all the defective pixels? That's up to you. I'm not going to pass comment on that. I don't really know what your failure rate was, how long a customer you've been. I don't want to get into the what is good customer service game. This whole presentation and survey was trying to find, engineering reasons why we had failures, not judge vendors on their response to them. That reminds me, I should have had a slide in here and highlighted. We had a comments box that just said, whatever comment you'd like to put on the survey, please put. Anyone that felt the need to tell me about their customer service experience with the vendor was mostly positive. We got a lot of people saying, this vendor did replace them all, or when I contacted this vendor that took care of me. I have a good heart that we got more positive comments, even though we didn't ask for them in the survey responses than we got negative ones. I got some pixels that looked like they were low in epoxy. I put liquid tape in them, never had any issues. That sounds like you had Paul's pixels from RGB Man, because that's kind of what one of the ways he was describing his epoxy issues. More insurance questions that really I don't have the ability to answer. Oh, Alan said, I'm Alan Hansen from Hansen Electronics. Hi, Alan Hansen. I've used epoxy myself for over 20 years, and it's awful stuff. No idea what epoxy of any pixel suppliers are using. Yeah, neither did the epoxy. So the epoxy guy I talked to owns a epoxy potting business in the U.S. If customers come to him with assemblies, he recommends solutions, literally, and he gets the customer's products potted for him. And he said, there's so many epoxies out there, and these guys are actually probably going to, the cheapest Chinese epoxy houses in China that don't even sell it. They just make it really cheap for anyone making stuff in China. Is what his theory was for where this epoxy is coming from. Because when he saw what pixel prices were, he's like, yeah, I could never get that close to anything that cheap.
Ramon, you've got your hand up. You can go ahead and ask.
Did you turn on unmuting? Because remember, people can't unmute.
Everybody's muted, and so I just asked them to unmute. Go ahead.
I think I hit that button on accident trying to get to the chat. I apologize. But great presentation, Bill. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Maybe everyone won't hate me now. Could the capacitors around the regulator be the cause and not the regulator? Maybe. There's some thought that maybe there's some oscillations going on. That there were some claims that some of Ray's pixels omitted those capacitors, but everyone I asked for pictures of their Ray's pixels from last year had the capacitors. So I cannot substantiate what I heard of that Ray was omitting parts, because I never actually saw it myself. But whether or not those capacitors are the failure point and they cause the regulator, I still think it's the regulator actually heating up. It was an internal fault for the regulator of the capacitors. That's an interesting theory. I don't really have a way to tell you yes or no.
So Bill, is there a second part to the presentation? I know Dave Peace had a group that
Yes,
was
I'm
set
sorry.
up.
Maybe we should. I'm losing behind in comments. Maybe we should move to that.
Yeah,
So
let's move forward and then we can come back and address anything else. Okay,
sorry about that, Ed.
no problem.
So Peace, you're up.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, no, that was excellent. Excellent presentation. Thank you for putting that together. So quite serendipitously, I had put this video out saying, hey, we as consumers need to band together so that we can ensure quality and safety of pixels moving forward. Kind of at the same time that Bill was putting this survey together. The good news is that kind of combined effort really, I think, lit a fire under lots of people to say, yeah, what can we do as consumers to make sure this, is resolved and, continues to not be an issue moving forward. So the nice thing about Bill's survey is that it captured all this data and that we were able to find commonalities and trends and identify where issues might have come sourced. So the issue now is going forward, how do we track this? How do we make sure that if there's large scale issues again, that we can track them, we can identify them early, and we can notify the greater public or talk to the vendors for a response if there is an issue that is happening. So I called for some volunteers. We have about 75 people in this. It's a consumer advocacy group, and we just put up a website called pixel.report. And what this site is for is basically so that we can ensure that we're having quality and safety in our pixels moving forward. So you go to pixel.report, and there's two primary goals of this website. Number one is education. As Bill said, there's certainly manufacturer side to this. There's certainly a consumer side to it as well. It could be user error. It could be, we push our systems quite dramatically. But as he pointed out, 2020 was pretty excessive in the failures. So how can we find these issues quickly and respond to them quickly? So number one is education, getting people to stop asking the question, where can I find the cheapest pixel? Who has the best deals? That, everybody on this call, I'd kind of encourage you when you see that question to respond with, do not look for the cheapest price. When you're talking about the price of these light shows that we're putting together, we're already spending a bundle of money. The difference between a risk and potentially a safer option or a less risky option is really not a huge price difference. So I'd implore everybody to help guide this conversation away from the cheapest pixel.
Hey, David, can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
Our pixels are what our audience sees, and they are a big expense to our overall display. But the fact of the matter is they're a small percentage of our overall cost. So when you're looking at the cost of your display and the setup and the infrastructure and everything else, the pixel is what is driving lights and power. The other things behind it really need to be taken into consideration, and this is where you should not cheap out. And I think number one is the most important thing. Don't cheap out.
Totally agree. Totally agree. It's a common place for people to start, right? Is where's the best deal? And we can all do our part in guiding people away from just trying to find the cheapest thing. So look for a vendor, number two here, look for a vendor that has a strong history selling pixels in the hobby, and that's well known. And number three here, this is, we're not saying don't buy from China, but be cautious when buying directly from China, because if there is a problem, especially if you have a large quantity of pixels, you're going to have less recourse if there's an issue. buying from US resellers, trusted resellers here stateside, you're going to be more protected if there are issues. And plus, you're going to be able to have recourse if it does come to that. But typically those issues are fewer because these vendors, as much as possible, as Bill said, try to maintain very, very strong quality. So. Number 4, do not pay with PayPal friends and family. Again, this is just a suggestion, right? It's for protection. It's if somebody's offering, hey, a discount with PayPal friends and family, that's great. The problem is that you have to pay from your bank account. You can't do a chargeback on the credit card if there is an issue. You lose, again, recourse with PayPal. They can't do anything in regards to that transaction. So if there is an issue, you kind of lose recourse there. So definitely keep that in mind. So the big thing here is, we do want to see a shift. And the only way we can have a shift is if consumers demand a change. And so what does the consumer need? Well, we want to have confidence in our lights, right? We want to have confidence that they're going to be safe and they're going to be quality. So the only way we can have that confidence is to have people report when there's issues over time so that we can see if there's trends. So this is what we're asking of pixel vendors to increase the visibility and the ease of us to be able to find issues, and for us to maintain that the quality is a high concern and a high importance. So number 1, this is something new. Pixel strings should have a conspicuous lot number or date of manufacture printed on the wire PC or affixed with a tag. One of the problems is, if you're like me, I have pixels from all sorts of vendors from all sorts of years. I have no way of identifying what came from what or when. So if there was an issue, unless it was something recent, I wouldn't really be able to tell you where it came from, who it came from. So we need to be able to track these down at the individual string level to see where they came from and when they were manufactured. So if we do find trends, we can identify lot numbers and groups. Just a general note here, pixels should not have a failure rate greater than 1 pixel in 1,000. As Bill said, people were submitting things with like 0.1%. Lower than 1.1%. Yeah, 1 in 1,000 is or less. That's perfectly normal. It's perfectly fine. They could happen at the beginning. They could happen during the season. So during the season, that's kind of a normal failure rate. But number 3 is pixels just should not catch fire. There's certainly a lot of personal responsibility that has to happen, but the manufacturer of those pixels needs to be very conscientious of pixels, of the build of those pixels and ensure that they don't catch fire. And if they do, again, we want them to be reported so that we can track them and understand if there's a specific lot that's affected. Number 4, when possible, fire-resistant materials should be used. Again, I think that Ray is already moving towards that. They may be more expensive, but again, hopefully, that's a Band-Aid a bit. It's a bit a safety measure, which is great, but we don't want pixels to catch on fire, period. But fire-resistant material certainly does help. Provide more honesty and transparency with regards to true wire gauge. Again, this has nothing to do with the failures necessarily. And I think we're all very, very clear that the wire gauge that are reported are not accurate, but we do want to make sure that those are getting communicated a little bit more accurately. And then finally, just responding to issues in a timely manner and performing a root cause analysis to widespread issues. I loved what Ray responded with his root cause analysis of the epoxy. Having that level of transparency is going to be critical for people to gain confidence, because if there's a problem, I want to know that the vendor has identified the issue, they have fixed the issue, and it's no longer going to be an issue. I always say this, a person, a company, anything, they are not judged by the fact that they have problems. We all have problems, we all have issues. They are judged by how they respond to those problems. So if Ray has a fire issue and he says, look, I had a fire issue, I've responded to it, here's why it happened, I fixed it, that's great, and that's fine. We want that transparency, and then people will build that confidence to buy from that person again. So again, this site is going to list the vendors that we as a community feel maintain these recommendations. We don't have them listed yet, but we are asking that the vendors are going to submit requests to be added, and then identifying which of those features they are supporting or going to support. And then, but most critically, most important is really for us as a community to continue the feedback loop. There was some comments in there saying, well, we should have a continuous survey. This is basically Bill's survey, just it's going to be carried on ad infinitum so that we can, again, if there's issues that are identified, we can jump on them quickly. This is not a vendor bashing thing. This is not a vendor promotion thing. This is an information thing. So there's already been a great response to this. And it's awesome to see, because you saw Boscoyo with the fire retardant Coro. Gilbert Engineering is coming out with the same thing. The fire resistant epoxy. I mean, you just look at how there's already been a big shift in response to this, and I just expect it to get better and better, which we're all going to benefit from, so which is great. So if people have issues in the forums, send it a Pixel report so they can submit the issue. I am not monitoring this. There's a separate group headed up by John Spiker that's going to be reviewing reports for validity, and again, not for bashing. As Bill said, there needs to be some level of review to make sure that this isn't just people submitting a bunch of things to bash, but then to see those reports and then draw some conclusions, and then see if there is a wider issue that needs to be communicated out to the vendors of a wider spread issue. So yeah, that's it from my side. I think, again, going forward, if we can just be very, very vigilant about reporting issues, I think we will be able to identify issues quicker, hold the vendors and the resellers and the manufacturers to account for quality, and it's just going to elevate the hobby even more. So that is all from my side. Do you guys have any questions regarding the kind of go forward plan?
So if there are any questions for Dave, if you want to raise your hand and we can have him address it. Okay. So just to recap, Dave, if people do have a failure, you're recommending that they go to your pixel.report website and fill out the information.
Yep, and I'll also be, this is like Inception, I'm going to post this video to that page as well. The big thing is, and as Bill said, this is about education. It's really, really about education. There's so many new people coming into this hobby, and we want to steer them away from making potentially poor choices. And we as a community just want to vote with our wallets and say, we care about quality and safety. Quality and safety, quality and safety. Those are the two words that I'm kind of trying to drill in.
Now, have you approached any of the vendors and discussed with them the points that you have on your website? And what is the overall opinion? I'm sure it's all over the board, but.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, and I actually had to pivot my verbiage on quite a lot of things just to make sure it was as neutral as possible and as least impactful. The good news is, we already have vendors that are conforming to all, if not, a lot of, if not all of these things already. So, kudos to them. They'll be basically, top of the list right away. And I think, it's just going to elevate the hobby in general so that everything becomes better.
Okay, so Todd Wright, we're going to take your question first. If you want to unmute yourself.
They can't unmute themselves. We as co-hosts have to click ask to unmute, and then they can.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yep, you are.
Actually, two things while David was talking. I thought of the second thing. The link to the site that you just showed, David, with the reporting website. Could we not maybe get who controls the xLights page, maybe add that link to like the resource or section of the xLights page website? That way it's an easy to find link.
I will add that link to xlights.org resources page.
Thank you, Will.
Well,
second thing, real quick, while I'm thinking about it, with the virtual thing coming up, is there maybe someone that could reach out to Ray and Daniel and all the manufacturers? I know we get a lot of the American vendors in there, but maybe get some of the manufacturers, or at least invite them into the virtual
So
thing.
Todd, I've asked Ray in the past. I've asked him 2 different years to present, and his response has been that his English is not so well. He just has not felt comfortable in doing it. But we can certainly ask again, both him and any of the other folks in China, so we can put that on our to-do list. Thanks, Todd. Paul, did you want to go ahead?
You gotta unmute him, remember.
Yeah, so
I'm taking care of it.
it's
Go ahead.
not really a question, but more of a statement that touches on what both Bill and I'm sorry, who was the other presenter?
David.
Dave Peace.
David. Nobody. It goes back to that whole fanboys and bashing people who raise issues on Facebook. Nobody bats an eyelid when the NTSB comes out with a statement that says, there's been reports of Chevy brakes are bad or Ford's got a steering linkage issue. I think it would be a good move for the community as a whole to move away from that mentality. This isn't about flaming people. This isn't about, the fact that somebody says, I had an issue shouldn't be cause for people to turn around and absolutely slate them online. It's a bad mentality to have for the community as a whole.
I totally agree. And, and that actually is the hope and the goal with this is, if there is an issue or a trend that is found, that we can notify the public in early, before it comes widespread.
So the Pixel Report website could essentially end up being, releasing a monthly report, or no, not even necessarily a monthly report, but if something pops up, it's quickly identifiable.
Yeah, if there's an identifiable trend, yeah, certainly. And I would just also point out that this is just a group of consumers, right? This is just people that are like you and I, they're just buying pixels. So they're trying to look at the reports, seeing if there's trends, just like Bill was doing. And if there are, I think that's the whole point, is we want to remove this from the underbelly, bring it to the forefront, try to get it resolved as quickly as possible, not to call out a vendor, but to offer a solution, to say, hey, these lot numbers or these manufacturing periods may have been affected with XY issue. We've seen an increase, like you said, it's just, we've seen an increase in reports during this time frame from this vendor for this type of issue. Hopefully that invites a response from the vendor that they've found the issue, they fixed the issue, and then we can all move forward. But
right, it's about visibility and accountability, right? I mean, and if that gets shut down by one person saying, I had this pit problem with this pixel, and everybody, well, not everybody, but a good portion of people, like you said, the noise shows up, said, well, I've used this person's pixels for years and never had an issue. Well, that's, like Bill said, it's completely counterproductive, because it doesn't matter if you've used them for years. The batch that you bought this year might have the one bad pixel in it that's going to burn your house down.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point Bill was trying to make too. I agree wholeheartedly. I think if somebody is saying I had an issue and the response is, well, I had a good issue or I had a good experience, it doesn't really help. I further isolates that person that had the issue. Where I think Bill was trying to say, right, is if those comments were suppressed, we might have reduced the noise to say, hey, I had the same issue. Hey, I had the same issue. Hey, I had the same issue. And then we could have maybe identified things sooner.
And then I wouldn't have been working on a presentation in the middle of golf while doing C testing. Get it done in time for this tonight.
Yeah. Mark Dixon, you've got a question?
Michael Downey from RGB Man was in the chat trying to jump in and
his mic is open. He can't talk.
He's since gone. So I was just going to say, since we couldn't talk, if we could let him say his piece, I think it'd be nice to have one of the vendors at least explain their situation.
Mark,
may have gone now, but
I explained that he had to raise his hand and we would unmute him. So
Right. And I don't know if he left or not, but that was just, I just wanted to bring up if RGB man was here, would like to hear what he had to say.
Do you feel I didn't, I conveyed the sentiment he told me, which I thought was a fair sentiment. He told me they were aware of an epoxy problem and have since solved it, and that any customer should contact them. Is there something more you would like to hear from them?
No, but he was saying he'd like to speak, and I don't know if it was missed in the chat,
Yeah,
but
he,
he
he's
may be
saying
gone now.
he's here. If he wants to speak, he can say something.
Okay.
Yeah, everybody
Next
can.
person, Paul.
Anybody can unmute themselves.
Yeah, everyone can unmute themselves.
Yeah.
But Paul, you're next. Your hand's raised.
I just want to tell you guys, I really appreciate you guys taking the time on this. I don't want to belabor that, but I think what you guys are doing is important. I think really what's going to be interesting to come out is to find out which vendors specifically are going to become more and more responsive. Like I see, for me personally, while we one fire or one smoldering, that really makes, this is my first year, for example. I spent a lot of time in the Zoom rooms. You guys helped me out a lot. But then all of a sudden I'm like taken aback, and one of my friends who wanted to do it are taken aback a little bit by coming into the xLights groups and seeing these fires, and they're like, oh my gosh, right? And I'm like, hey, listen, it's 1 in a million. But as someone who works in insurance myself and I'm an agent for a major insurance company, I'm sitting here like, wow, okay, that's a lot of risk when you think about as wonderful as this hobby is, it's not like something like cooking that must happen every single day. Like, it's a risk you're willing to take, getting in a car and taking your children. So when you're talking about risk, that's really not an unnecessary risk, and then take into consideration with the context of a hobby, it really exaggerates how it could actually really ruin the hobby of the DIY lighting situation. So what you guys are doing right now, in my personal opinion, is bringing this to the forefront and giving a lot about a peace of mind. We kind of know what the previous past batches look like. It's good we're seeing some response from some things. I'll be honest with you, I didn't feel that Ray's response was probably adequate enough, but then again, there could be some language translation, some barriers there. I'll look forward to hearing some more, because he's always been a really good vendor for a lot of people. But then again, at the same time, people change and businesses change, right? So I just want to tell you guys how much I appreciate you doing this, because it's given me some faith that I can go out there and buy some pixels from, probably in this case, U.S. vendors who are ultimately going to allow me to feel that there's some nominal safety to what we're doing.
Okay. Can I just comment that let's leave this for questions for the presenters, and then afterwards, if people have individual comments or want to congratulate folks, not a problem. Gary, you're up next.
Yeah, just a quick question for David. Are you guys planning to institute some sort of email list that people can maybe put their name on or email on, and when you do start getting enough reports that you're seeing that there is a consistent issue going on, you guys can then shoot off an email to all the people? That way there's one centralized location everything's coming from, as opposed to a bunch of Facebook groups.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was actually brought up in our group as a suggestion, and I think that it's a great one. So we're trying to take a couple baby steps, just kind of gather some data, but ultimately, I think absolutely. And just to be totally clear, I sell circuit boards, right? But I don't sell pixels. But just the fact that I sell things could potentially be viewed as a conflict of interest. So I'm helping kind of set this up, get some people that are willing to run with it, and then I'm going to kind of step back and let them kind of own it going forward. But yeah, just as far as the email is concerned, I think that's a great idea, especially if we can, like you said, if people want to be notified of issues proactively, that's the best way to do it. Hey, if there's a widespread issue with X vendor in this issue, it's going to be a really great opportunity to reach out to a group.
So some of the ideas I have about that, as we get reports, the challenge is going to be that there's going to be a lot of reports of people just pissed off. So we need to be able to filter those, but actually look at real reports, and potentially, I'm not 100% sure yet how I want to do it. Maybe it's a monthly report, maybe it's a quarterly report, to be able to provide feedback to the community, or emergency reports. I mean, I'm in IT, so if there's something that happens that's critical, then send out a broadcast message. But we're going to look at different ways to be able to keep communicating with the community as to the different vendors and what they're supplying and what's being reported that is validated.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Thanks, John. And
Okay, sorry.
no, I was just gonna say, yeah, that I think the flame war stuff, you know, as Bill said in his thing, I think it's usually pretty easy to see when somebody's just trying to like whine and complain about somebody versus somebody that has a valid complaint. So that's why we have a group of people to kind of look at that stuff and see if there is some sort of trend.
Okay, Chris L.
Thank you for taking my call. Long time listener, first time caller. Hey, speaking of flame wars, when you got congratulations on both of you guys for doing a great job on this project. I know when you guys first kicked it off, I kind of backed out the door when you guys asked for volunteers because I saw everything coming to loggerheads, and I was feeling bad for you guys. But looks like you did a great job. So, with that being said, when you're talking about flame wars, I'm just curious, since you guys have been talking to the manufacturers or the manufacturer reps, just curious if they've been on board or if they've been on top of this situation the whole time. Because it seems like from what you guys were saying in the presentation, you mentioned something to them, they're already on top of it. They're like, yeah, we know there's an epoxy problem, we've already fixed it, done deal.
Are you asking me to rate the response I got from the vendors?
Sure.
Yeah, both of them to me were upfront, honest, and said we've already solved it and we think it's not going to be a problem anymore. So the answer that some people I've seen ask the same question: do we think this has been solved? You know, honestly, my first response to that is ask your vendor yourself. Don't take my word or what I say the vendor said through me. And the second part is, you know, both vendors did seem like they acknowledged the problem and have already fixed it.
So, Bill, can I interject? I think the issue is that the vendor knew and the individual knew, but
they
the
didn't come out with it
community,
already.
right?
Yeah.
The community wasn't aware, and I think that's the point that hopefully will be resolved. So,
If
Scott, you're up next.
If you go back to slide 3, that was one of my points, is the hope that vendors are more
Right.
open to stuff in the future.
Yep, Scott, you're up.
I'm me, Scott.
Scott McCoy.
Okay, thank you. Well done, guys. Really appreciate the info and all the work you put into this. I had to step out during the middle of it for a minute, so I don't know if maybe I missed this. When a pixel went bad and somebody reported it to you, sent you pictures and so forth, was there any work done with the rest of that string to investigate if there are any other cracks, missing epoxy or anything like that to see? Usually if it's a batch problem, it's probably going to be more than just the one pixel in a string.
To me, a lot of the responses I got on fires was one fire. It wasn't like they had strings of firecrackers going off. They had one pixel catch fire, and that's what they were reporting.
Right, but did the rest of the string then get checked once it gets taken out of circulation and you fix that one?
Again, my time's not infinite, so I didn't go through and try to get back with everyone that reported a fire and ask them that kind of question. So I really don't know. You know, I talked to Spiker intensively because he's my friend and he had the most extreme reaction to these issues. What did you do, Spiker? You're a person that had a fire. Did you test the rest of the pixels after that? You throw them all away?
No, I actually cut out hundreds of pixels, to be honest with you. I went down the entire string, looked at all of them. I spent hours and hours and hours investigating them. And the honest truth was, I didn't really find anything that said the string was bad.
Okay, so it was to you, John, it seemed like it might have just been the one pixel in a string that had an issue of some sort and not like a bunch of them. Because I've had a couple strings this year that had maybe 3 or 4. As I'm putting them in, they just looked wonky. They weren't full of resin like they should be or something. So I actually was filling them with liquid electrical tape just because I'm anal like that. But
was you Paul or RGB Man?
I got him from RGB Man.
Okay, he was describing to me that was more or less the main epoxy issue they had, was the epoxy issue. The epoxy injection machine wasn't filling them correctly.
Yeah. So I found some, but it was 3 or 4 maybe or 5 in the string. So to me, it was that, like a batch. It's obviously doing them all a lot at a time through the machines. And I was just curious if anybody else found, if you had a fire in one, if it then all of a sudden you found other ones in that string that were maybe kind of what that one was like before it caught fire.
I didn't honestly. I didn't find anything questionable, and I went as far as bought floor cameras, hooked them back up. I've done a lot of testing, which was all for nothing. I'll be honest with you. It was a waste of money and a waste of time. I didn't find anything. There was no commonality on the string.
Okay, Martin, you're up. These are the last. I was going to say last two, but we've got 3 more. So Martin.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, guys. I had failures. I didn't go into the report. I was just too busy with my work. 5 volts, but basically, as soon as it started raining, now we're not talking 1 pixel, it'd be like 3, 4, 5. I'd cut them out, replace them, bang, 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 all same batch. So should I put that information into the report onto that website that you're setting up, or not worry about it until new ones?
No, I think any information is good. I think it's the more data, the better, right? And so if there's issues that could be indicative of a trend, I think that's important to capture. So for sure.
Yeah, there was some, well, just no epoxy in it. And after talking to people like David, he said just cut them out and chuck them out. Don't bother trying to fill them.
Dave Kobe.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for taking my question. Great presentation. I think this is a question for Bill. I guess I really appreciated the explanation of how the fusing doesn't necessarily prevent fires. I guess my question is anybody working on, or is there any technological solution to, detect a fault at the end of the string or something and then turn the lights off?
So I've heard someone else had the idea for detecting into the string. I don't think it'll work. I have an idea, and I've already given it to Pitts. The problem is, to be honest, we're going to have to pay more to implement it. And I'll give this freely to anybody, for anyone that's a pixel controller that wants to design it. I think your pixel controller already knows about the data it's sending to the pixels. It should be able to calculate a running total of the expected current draw that port should draw, since it's sending out the data of certain brightness values. So you could have a pixel controller always running a math count of, okay, I have this many pixels at this brightness, I should expect 1.2 amps out this port. And then you'd have to implement current sensing on the port. And if that port was drawing 3 amps instead of 1.2, that's bad. Shut the controller down, cut off power. I think there's an arc fault forming. People have started arc fault discussions about, does an arc fault breaker that the power supply is plugged into catch these fault? Absolutely not. Your power supply isolates arc faults on the DC side from the AC side. So arc fault breakers won't work. But if you implemented something in the controller that tracked expected current versus measured current, I think we could find a regulator heating off before it actually gets to the point of burning something. But
that wouldn't work as soon as you do power injection, right, Bill?
Right. There's 2 draws to that. You'd have to build smart power distribution boards that could be logically assigned to outputs on the mini controller. Those would make those more expensive, and you'd have to have a configuration window saying, here's my power injection ports on my distro boards to this string. So that power injection becomes a problem and costly. The controller gets to be 50, maybe more dollars more expensive. But again, we're putting this all up for what was a very small percentage of issues. So I don't know if there's justification in that idea, but that is an idea that I think would work. I don't think the end of the line would work at all.
But plus, earlier in your conversation, when you presented the fact that if you power inject versus not power injecting, that changes the amount of current that actually the string can draw. So those are other parameters too. Did someone inject on a 400 pixel string? I mean, how do we really know what the current really should be, or going out due to those other factors that you brought up earlier?
Well, like I just told Keith a second ago, you'd have to have smart power distribution boards that you could logically assign ports to logical strings.
Right, yeah, I'm just saying for the average user, it becomes very complicated.
Oh, I agree. It's not a great idea. I just said it's the only one I could think of.
And it add a component that you'd have to push the power through so that you could switch it off, and that would also in itself heat up.
Yeah, I was thinking a crowbar circuit to actually blow the port fuse is what you do.
Well, they also have e-fuses that you could put on every port, for $2 a piece, and then you can control each one, to cut the power off. But again, it's how do you know when is it going to cause a lot of false positives? Are you going to be cutting people's shows off just because, the current in itself is hard to gauge really. I mean, you can calculate theoretical current, like I said, but it's hard to know exactly how it was wired and if that's going to be the true current being drawn from the string.
For the sake of this presentation and recording, we should take that off to another Zoom where there's more drinking involved.
Hey, Ed, could I bring it kind of back to what we've been talking about?
Lee Lindquist, you're up.
Hey, thanks. Just a question I asked in the chat: were any of the
Lost Lee. Someone
You muted yourself, Lee.
Oh, sorry, I thought I unmuted. Thanks. Were
Guess
any of the
Starlink hasn't kicked
pixel?
in yet.
Yeah, were any of the pixel fires from pixels that had never been outdoors?
Not that anyone reported.
Okay, Arnold, you're up.
Yeah, so I don't you in the talk did you have any theories on why this year's regulators what did since it looks like it was correlated with regulators, do you have a sort of a failure theory on why this year and why a batch or this batch?
Well, it would be just that, a theory, because I'm not a manufacturer of pixels. We saw last year a pretty ridiculous race to the bottom of cost, even for regulated pixels. And the technology didn't improve to justify that price reduction. So what's the only thing that can cause a price reduction if technology didn't improve? I think cheaper parts or corners were cut.
Okay, Mark M., you're up.
Back to the comment there was for liquid electrical tape. How well does hot glue do to seal up if you have bad pixels, just to at least get a year out of them or get through the season?
I don't recommend hot glue in anything that goes outside in hot weather. Are you in a hot climate during the Christmas season?
I am myself, yes.
Your hot glue will run out of your pixels when you get hot enough.
Yeah, most of them, hot glue won't do too badly under the shade. And definitely you can get away with hot glue to seal things onto brick.
Okay, Paul Celia, you up?
Actually, we were gonna go do that breakout room thing. I actually had to.
Okay, Ryan, you're up.
So as a kind of consumer, I guess the main things I've kind of heard to protect myself are to be a smart buyer, maybe inspect some of my pixels for cracked epoxy, and maybe turn off the power supply to my lights during the day when I'm not running. Are there any other recommendations you have to help at least hedge your bets and stay safe?
I know Ken's probably going to hear me cringe when I say this, but just make sure you understand who you're buying from. Either talk to them. This is a person you're going to drop probably a couple $1,000s with, so it'd probably be a good idea to make sure they're a real person, that they talk to you, that they tell you why you should buy from them, and go from there.
Okay,
Actually,
Mike.
Ken just PM'd me and he said everybody should send him a private message. So,
no, don't do that.
Mike Downey, you're up.
Oh, sorry. You know what? All I had was thumbs up and clapping. So I guess I was clapping for everybody as they were talking. So good job. The only thing I was going to say here is that the thing I think that the thing that we need to be careful on is a little bit of the perception, such as when I saw that that the Coro guys were doing the kind of fire retardant Coro. I contacted my person in China and talked to them about, what can we do to be a little more, fire resistant. And he contacted the factory, and I was surprised to come back that the factory that I am purchasing from, and I know that a few of the vendors are purchasing from, already had the most fire resistant epoxy and that could stay clear in it. And so, I guess the thing that we just need to make sure is that, during all the hype stuff and everything else, that, like Bill just got through saying, actually contact your vendor and find out what's going on, and don't just look at posts and say, oh, gee whiz, this, nobody else has this, but this person, because it really isn't true. And like I've heard Ray's name several times here about how he's doing this and doing that and doing this. And the thing is that I'm going to be honest with you, all the China vendors that I know of that are trusted by the community, every single one of them want us to be safe. Not one of them wants to go out of business because of the fact that their pixel did this or their pixel did that, because money really talks. Like David Peace was saying earlier, money talks. And but on the opposite end of that, also, please do understand that U.S. vendors such as Ken, myself, Gilbert Engineering, Bob over at Holiday Shop, Lighting Shop, and all these different people, we have to trust our vendors as you guys are trusting us. And like Bill was saying, that when I found out that there was an epoxy issue, it wasn't because I asked. Because I was asking, hey, is there something going on? And then when I found out that the epoxy issue was there, was when they couldn't ship on time because they had the epoxy machine down and they were fixing it. So the thing is that us vendors, we also have to trust our vendors that they're doing that they're doing the right thing. And so, it's going to be a little bit of a slow process. I've worked with people from Japan and China for 20 years. In fact, for a long time, I was a product manager. And sometimes they like to tell you what you want to hear, even though that maybe they're going to try to scramble to do it or whatnot. But the thing is just know every vendor that I know of here in the United States, every single one of them, I know for a fact that every single one of them wants you to be happy and wants you to have a good product. And so even before all of this, these vendors were talking with their people in China and finding out what they could do and finding out things and whatnot. And so I'm really for this. I'm really for the whole thing of holding their feet to the fire. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But just realize and understand that when we're working with them, we're doing the best we can to work with them, and they have to work with whatever factory they're working with. And yes, there's more than one factory, by the way. And you just got, it's a time-intensive process, but it will work. And I'm hoping that, with us vendors being a little more on the alert, that it's going to do nothing but improve. But just realize and understand that because somebody says something doesn't mean that every vendor is not doing that. It just means that you need to ask your vendor and say, hey, this person's doing this. What are you guys doing? And you may be surprised to find out what they're doing. So anyway, that's all I was going to say. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. Michael Muff.
Yeah, I guess the one comment I wanted to make or question I wanted to ask is, we keep talking about what's a quality pixel, but I don't hear anybody talking about defining what we want out of the pixel as far as performance and of the components and performance of the epoxy and performance of the plastics that are being used, performance of the wire coatings and all of the engineering aspects of that pixel. If you really want a quality pixel, we should define what the specification is and then ask the vendors to meet that specification and prove that they meet that specification to meet our needs.
So one thing I might, sorry, I was just going to say, the one thing I would say to that is, as soon as you get into, demanding a certain type of material or a certain type of quality of material that's being used, then you have to get into actually verifying and certifying it. And that level of involvement, I think, is probably a little beyond the scope of the community. But the reporting, I think, will still flesh out the same issues. Right, is if people have an issue where their wires are catching on fire, well, then maybe it's a problem with the outer material of the wire. So, I think that the concept of what you're describing is sound, but I think the report will still get at that same data is we want to hold their feet to the fire of accountability so that we can see when these trends occur. So if there are component issues, we should see those trends pretty cleanly.
Okay.
So my response, hold on, I want to respond to that too. My response to that is those types of things are very hard to define in a quantitative manner. What makes a good wire? Vendors aren't going to listen to us because we don't have any say in that. And someone in chat answered the question most succinctly. That's why USA vendors are here. They are doing that on our behalf, hopefully. That's why we pay for US vendors. They are supposed to make sure that quality is adhered to make a safe and quality pixel. Absolutely. That's my whole point for the value added to American vendors. I had one more thing I wanted to show before we stop recording, so I forgot to put it in my presentation ahead. Hold on. This was the theme for my presentation right there. I stole that from somebody else.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, there you go.
So can I ask one final question?
Sure.
I saw that some people were testing fire retardant stuff to spray on Coro. Does any of that work? And is that something that y'all would recommend that folks do?
I think the best person to answer that is probably Chris, since he's the bachelor in science and fire here. And I don't think he's on because he's actually working, putting salt on snow roads right now.
Okay. Okay. Well,
I'd like to kind of comment about that though.
Oh, James wants to answer that one.
And actually, I think John Spiker has done a lot of testing on that, and he would be probably our local subject matter expert.
Yeah.
But I think one of the issues, one of the videos I saw from John was he applied a flame retardant or fire resistant material to the outside of the Coro. And then he takes his blowtorch and he heats it for literally, I don't know, 5-6 seconds. And it's just sitting there absorbing all the heat in it before it finally burns through. Well, that flame is well beyond what, a pixel fire is. I think one of the bigger limitations was that, 10 millimeter pixel, depending on where the fire is at with the pixel in regard to the location of the regulator, it's going to end up being inside the Coro. It's 10 millimeters thick. So, but putting an exterior coating doesn't do any good if you can still ignite the Coro from the inside out. The second problem was the exterior applied flame retardants. They didn't hold up well to UV. They broke down. They're really some harsh chemicals. And I think that was one of John's bigger complaints with that material, other than they were very expensive. And so that's one of the reasons we approached it as we want to put a flame retardant into the material itself. So it doesn't matter where it's touched with a fire. If it's on the inside, the outside of the Coro, it still won't catch on fire. I think John's going to share some of the videos that he did of the flame retardant application materials. He's been with several of the vendors that sell this product, and one of them very extensively. But again, it's expensive, and I really don't think that's going to be John's recommendation to apply this stuff to Coro.
No, I will say, James, you're absolutely correct. As much testing as I've done, we're getting
it didn't move the
feedback.
needle, right?
No, it worked. There's a lot of feedback. It worked, but it just wasn't something I would put on my own house.
Okay. Thanks, John.
I got a question. My hand's actually been up this whole time, Ed. No one's called on me. I got a question for Paul, the insurance guy, before we stop recording. Is Paul, the insurance guy, still here?
I'm still here.
So I may have lost a few friends starting the survey because they didn't think there was enough justification for us to try to collect this data. And one of my arguments was, if this becomes more of an issue, if we see more houses catching fire, won't the insurance companies notice, and won't they start punishing those people they see with pixel displays after that? Is that a valid estimate of what could happen?
I think when you think about the grand scheme of things, the answer is no, because when you start looking at pixel displays, ultimately, what is it? Okay. It's hard to specify pixel displays versus traditional AC lights. We could argue that for years, there's probably been more of a fire risk of people running C9 incandescent lights stringing them from end to end. And my dad, remember back in the day, putting extension cords out in the snow with very little duct tape around them. I mean, you really think about how crazy it was. There was probably more risk in that than there's ever been in the entire industry. And what we do is so minor in even the grand scope of people putting up Christmas lights on their house. It wouldn't even blip on their radar. In fact, to the point that used to be a big thing about, I mean, I work, so a little background on myself, been with the company for 9 years. I'm a liability specialist. So when we're talking about analyzing and like dissecting all of this, I'm the guy to ask, and not to prop myself up or anything. But at the end of the day, for example, there was a major push in the industry about specifically like trampolines, right? The problem is that with trampolines, there just isn't that many trampolines. So we used to deny umbrella policies for people who had trampolines. They're dangerous. There's no getting around it. Trampolines are one of the most dangerous things you can have in your backyard. But the frequency of trampolines and the math behind denying people and the cost associated with them was so minor, we realized that we were turning down more money for umbrella policies and homeowners insurance policies than we were losing by insuring people in that risk. So sometimes the risk really has to be quantified in such a measure to ultimately deny someone an insurance policy because of their actions. Now, one things that we do ultimately decline for is you're going to see things like, for example, people who do pottery and run kilns in their garage where thousands of degrees are involved, right? Those things have excessive, unnecessary. But then again, that's so specific because I can easily say you shouldn't run a kiln in your garage. But saying you can't put up pixels versus Christmas lights, it's so blurry that you'll never get an insurance contract that's going to be able to defer between one or the other. I know that's a lot of information, but hopefully that kind of clarifies it.
No, I think that probably makes a lot of people feel better in here.
Thanks.
That said, let me clarify one point. So someone brought up about an umbrella policy, and I'll be honest, I initially shot it down. I'm like, what does an umbrella policy have anything to do with your holiday light display? At first, I'm like, that has nothing to do with the cost of like replacing your contents or clothing, because umbrellas are just liability only. But I would argue that because of what's called a nuisance attractant, where you're creating such a beautiful display and people come drive by your home and get distracted by it, or someone comes over and hurts themselves and trips on your property, the probability of your insurance company turning you down because of your actions that are attracting people to your house, no differently if you were trying to run a 7-Eleven out of your garage, though, okay, would be more of a likelihood for an insurance company to turn you down because of the attractant issues, like all the things that we saw. How many people stopped doing their displays this year because they had people giving their HOAs giving them hell, right? Those things. It's more of a liability risk in getting shut down. And it is a legitimate risk. I mean, you could attribute negligence to what you're doing, but it would be also very difficult to get a direct case on it, only because I could argue that Joe's lights across his street that have nothing to do with pixels are just as pretty and caught my eye, and I ran into the guy in front of me. So that's all I got on that.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you guys for a really great presentation. If there are any other questions, we'll address them after the recording and after announcements. So and just to remind everybody that every week after the xEssentials presentation, there is a help session. So you can feel free to bring your questions on Wednesday night or 24/7. This Zoom room is available to you for questions. So we'll now go into the announcements portion of the call. As many of you are aware, the virtual Christmas Summit is coming up on April 10th and 11th. We will have 9 simultaneous Zoom rooms going with a bunch of different classes on various different topics, as well as we'll have a build room going on, building a bunch of different projects, some new, some old ones, as well as a vendor room where we will be having vendors who can, are available to address any of your questions, concerns, sometimes give you a behind the scenes tour and whatnot. So that is April 10th and 11th. Registration will open the end of the month, and this is a free presentation to all that attend. Any other announcements that folks have? Are there any upcoming minis or conferences that people want to touch on? I'll go ahead with Florida. The Florida Mega Mini is happening on May 1st and 2nd in Celebration, Florida, which is right near Disney. It is a 2-day conference. We will be having, prior to the conference, a Lightorama intensive as well as an X-Lights intensive. So we hope to see anybody that's interested in coming to it. Anyone else? Transworld I know is coming up. Is that May 5th or 6th? I don't know if anyone wants to bring it up.
And also the Better California event is happening August 14th and 15th in Northridge, California, for the West Coast Christmas experience. So we bumped ours a little bit because California's trailing a little bit in everything. I mean,
Heartland Mini, do you want to touch on the dates for that? In Texas, I think you've got one coming up as well, North Texas group.
Yeah, Ed, we do. Our workshop is going to be 2 days, June the 26th and 27th.
Great. And how should people, if they're interested, what's the name of the group, Donna?
NTXHL. North Texas Holiday Lightaholics.
Yeah. Dave,
And
what was the name of your group too?
West Coast Christmas Experience.
Okay. And the Florida group?
We've got a website out there for the registration.
Great. The Florida group is Extreme Lighting Fanatics of Florida. I know Heartland Mini. I don't know if anybody from that group is here. They've got one coming up the end of April as well. Is it in Kansas City? I'm not sure. Someone wants to touch on it? Okay.
Yeah. I haven't done my research. April 17th, it's going to be in Platte City, which is right outside of Kansas City, minutes from the airport. Same place it was 2 years ago. I'm not actually on the committee anymore. I just happen to know.
Yeah. Are there any other events that people are aware of? Any other announcements? So last point I have is that next week we are going to start our first time ever doing a roundtable discussion. So next week is wisdom from veterans and questions from beginners. So what I'd ask is that if you're a veteran display person, whether it's X-Lights or whatever other software you use, if you could tell a newbie 5 things to do to avoid mistakes, make your list and bring them, and the floor will be open for you to share your wisdom. And if you're a newbie and you've got questions and you've been afraid to ask, bring them as well. So we will basically be having a roundtable discussion. Folks are free to turn their cameras on and talk, but this is the first time we've tried that for xEssentials. So that will be next week. The week after, we do have I think Jeffrey Holmes, who will be talking. I forget what the topic is, but Jeffrey Holmes is a great presenter. I think it's on designing your display, if memory serves me right. So I look forward to everybody joining us the week after. So that's all I got. Anybody else? Last chance for announcements. Okay. Thanks, guys. I'm going to stop the recording, and if the live stream would stop to the official group, that'd be great. And anyone interested in carrying on this conversation, I see Scott McCoy, you've got your hand up.